All right, ready to dive into some thought experiments.
Let's do it.
I figured you'd be into this. I mean, as a philosopher, you're practically swimming in thought experiments all the time, right?
Ha, you could say that. It's definitely familiar territory. But even something familiar can hold hidden depths.
Right, that's what I was thinking. Like, we throw the term thought experiment around a lot, but have you ever stopped to think, like, what are these things really? How do they work?
Absolutely. It's easy to take them for granted, especially in philosophy.
So for this deep dive, we're going to use the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on thought experiments. It's like our guidebook for this journey. And the mission, well, it's to unpack what thought experiments are, how they function, and why they hold so much power for learning and understanding, especially for a philosopher like yourself.
Sounds like a plan.
So first things first, how about we just try and define what a thought experiment actually is?
Ah, that's the tricky part, isn't it? There's not one universally accepted definition.
Really?
It's kind of like trying to define art. You know it when you see it, but putting it into words can be surprisingly difficult.
So maybe that's part of the beauty of them. They defy easy categorization.
Perhaps, but we can still get a better grasp through examples and by looking at their key characteristics.
Okay, examples. I like where this is going.
Let's travel back in time to ancient Rome. Imagine Lucretius, the philosopher, pondering the nature of space. He comes up with this spear-throwing argument. Picture someone hurling a spear at the supposed edge of the universe, right?
Okay, I'm picturing it. A spear flying through the cosmos.
Now, if the spear goes through, well, that means it's not really an edge. And if it bounces back, there has to be something beyond that edge for it to bounce off of, right?
Right, either way, there's more space.
Exactly. So Lucretius concludes, there can't be an edge. Space must be infinite.
Oh, the classic spear-throwing argument. I remember wrestling with that one back in my intro to philosophy class. But wait, doesn't modern cosmology kind of throw a wrench into this?
You got it. The way we understand space today, with things like the curvature of space-time and the expanding universe, well, it paints a more nuanced picture.
So even though Lucretius's conclusion might not hold up perfectly today, it still demonstrates some core elements of thought experiments, right?
Absolutely.
There's that element of visualization and the imaginative manipulation of concepts, playing around with the idea of the spear at the edge of the universe. And then there's drawing a conclusion based on that mental exercise, even if, as we've seen, that conclusion might need some tweaking later on down the line.
It really highlights the power of thought experiments to push our thinking.
Exactly. They force us to confront the limits of our current understanding, even if they sometimes lead us down the wrong path initially.
The journey itself can be incredibly valuable.
Okay, so we've dipped our toes into the what-if thought experiments. Now, a question our philosophically inclined listener might be asking is, where does philosophy fit into all of this?
Yeah, good point. We often associate thought experiments with science, but their influence on philosophical thought, it's huge, really pervasive.
Oh, totally. We can see this in some of the most famous thought experiments out there, right? Like, what about Searle's Chinese room? That one always gets my gears turning.
A classic.
The idea of someone inside a room manipulating Chinese symbols without actually understanding their meaning. It really makes you question what consciousness and intelligence really are.
Right. It challenges our assumptions about what it means to understand something.
And then there's Putnam's Twin Earth, a world exactly like ours, except the water, there isn't H2O, but something else entirely. Whoa.
That one really forces us to grapple with the relationship between language, meaning, and reality itself. Like, what does water really refer to?
These examples show how thought experiments in philosophy aren't just like abstract exercises. They dig into some of the deepest questions about how we understand the world, ourselves, the nature of knowledge, all that good stuff.
Precisely. They help us unpack these incredibly complex ideas in a way that's both engaging and thought-provoking.
Now, given the sheer variety of thought experiments out there, are there ways to categorize them? Like bring some order to this vast meta landscape.
Absolutely. Philosophers and scientists have come up with all sorts of ways to classify thought experiments. It's like creating a taxonomy to organize these fascinating tools of thought.
So it's about creating a framework to understand their different roles and approaches.
Exactly. It helps us make sense of their diversity.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What kind of classifications are we talking about here?
Well, there are several approaches, but let's focus on two main ones for our listeners' sake. We can classify them by their purpose, what they're trying to achieve, and by their logical structure, how they're built.
Purpose and structure. Got it. Let's start with purpose. How do thought experiments differ in terms of what they're trying to do?
Well, some thought experiments, like Galileo's famous cannonball experiment, are primarily illustrative. Their goal is to make a complex idea more accessible.
So they're like intellectual scaffolding, helping us build an understanding of tricky concepts.
Exactly. They illuminate a concept, like inertia in Galileo's case, by providing a vivid mental image to grasp onto. We might call these heuristic thought experiments.
Heuristic, meaning they serve as aids to understanding.
Precisely. But then we have thought experiments with a more let's say, combative purpose?
Combative, you mean they're going after something?
Exactly. These are what we might call critical thought experiments. Their aim isn't to explain, but to challenge a particular theory. Like, think of the Gettier problems in epistemology.
Ah, yes, get to your problems. Those were designed to show that the traditional definition of knowledge as justified true belief wasn't quite cutting it. They gave examples where someone could have a justified true belief without actually knowing.
Exactly. They were like intellectual torpedoes aimed at exposing weaknesses in existing theories.
Fascinating. But not all thought experiments are about tearing things down, right? Some might actually be trying to defend a particular viewpoint.
You're right. There's a category we might call apologetic thought experiments. These come to the defense of a theory. Take Maxwell's demon, for instance.
Okay, Maxwell's demon. Refresh my memory. What was that one about again?
It was a thought experiment designed to reconcile the second law of thermodynamics with statistical mechanics. Essentially, it argued that a hypothetical being, this demon, could violate the second law under very specific circumstances.
So instead of attacking a theory, it was trying to bolster a specific framework.
Precisely. And this variety of purposes highlights a crucial point. To judge a thought experiment, you got to know what it's trying to do. A thought experiment meant to just illustrate an idea might be considered successful even if it doesn't perfectly reflect reality. But one trying to definitively prove a point, well, that's a much higher bar.
Makes sense. It's like judging a tool based on its intended use. You wouldn't use a hammer to saw wood, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got these different purposes for thought experiments, but you also mentioned classifying them by their logical structure. What's that about?
One common way to do that is to distinguish between necessity refuters and possibility refuters.
Okay, those sound intriguing. Break those down for me.
Well, necessity refuters, like those Gettier problems we talked about, they aim to show that something a theory says is impossible is actually possible.
Ah, so they're poking holes in a theory's claim to absolute truth by finding exceptions.
Exactly. They're like, hey, your theory says this can never happen, but look, here's an example where it does happen. And that challenges the supposed necessity of the theory's claims.
I see. A clever tactic. And what about possibility refuters?
These are more about exploring the different possibilities a theory might allow, often leading to weird paradoxes or unexpected consequences.
Sounds tricky. Do you have an example?
Sure. Imagine the classic thought experiment of an omnipotent god trying to create a stone so heavy even they can't lift it.
Oh yeah, the omnipotence paradox. Always a mind bender.
Right. It forces us to confront the potential contradictions within the very concept of omnipotence. Can an all-powerful being create a limit for itself?
It seems like this type of thought experiment isn't necessarily about refuting a specific theory, but more about probing the internal logic of a concept itself.
Precisely. It's about pushing the boundaries of our understanding and seeing where those boundaries might break down.
So we've got purpose and structure as ways to classify thought experiments, but it seems like understanding the purpose is key to judging whether a thought experiment is actually, doing what it sets out to do.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that a thought experiment designed to just illustrate an idea might not be suitable for providing definitive proof, and vice versa.
It's about choosing the right tool for the job, essentially.
Exactly.
Now, this makes me wonder about the historical context of thought experiments. Are they a recent invention, or have philosophers been using them for centuries? Like, did Plato and Aristotle ever dabble in thought experiments?
That's a great question, and it often leads to some interesting discussions. While the term Gedanken experiment has often credited to Ernst Mach in the 19th century.
Yeah, that's the one I've heard too.
The concept itself is way older. Even the term itself predates Mach. For example, folks like Hans Christian Ørsted were using tank experiment, the Danish term, before Mach.
So, the formal label might be relatively recent, but the actual practice of thought experiments has been around for much longer.
Precisely. Think about it. Philosophers have always been engaging in hypothetical reasoning, exploring possibilities in their minds.
That's what philosophy is, in a way.
You could say that, and what's fascinating is how these thought experiments have been used throughout philosophical history. Pre-Socratic philosophers, for example, used them to explore the fundamental nature of reality.
Wow, so we're talking way back.
Yep. And then medieval philosophers used them to wrestle with theological concepts. And of course, modern philosophers continue to use them in all sorts of areas.
So we've got this long and rich tradition of thought experiments in philosophy. We've explored how they're defined, or at least how they resist easy definition, and how they've been categorized. But the big question that's still bugging me is, how do these things actually work? I mean, how could just thinking about a scenario teach us anything real about the world? Seems a bit like armchair philosophy, you know?
Ah, yes, that's the core of the matter, isn't it? And it's a question that has fueled a lot of debate among philosophers and scientists. To dive into that debate, we'll need to move on to the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, so we've talked about what thought experiments are, at least in a loose sense. But I gotta admit, I'm still a bit skeptical. How can we be sure we're actually learning something about the real world just by playing around with these imaginary scenarios? It feels a bit like, armchair philosophizing, just sitting around and thinking without actually getting our hands dirty.
You've hit upon the million-dollar question that has both philosophers and scientists scratching their heads. How can something that happens purely in the mind teach us anything about the actual world out there?
It's like trying to bake a cake without any ingredients. You can imagine it all you want, but you're not going to end up with anything edible.
The Stanford Encyclopedia actually presents a whole spectrum of views on this, from total skepticism to more nuanced takes.
Oh, a philosophical buffet. I'm hungry.
Let's start with the skeptics, those who are wary of the supposed power of thought experiments. Pierre Duhem, a physicist and historian of science, was particularly critical. He saw thought experiments as distractions, just armchair speculation with no real connection to the complexities of actual science.
A staunch empiricist, I take it.
Absolutely, someone deeply grounded in the physical world, suspicious of these mental wanderings.
Did he have any specific arguments against thought experiments, or was it more of a general distrust?
Duhem actually advocated for their banishment from science altogether. He believed they were ultimately useless and potentially even misleading.
Wow, a hardliner.
But, as the Stanford Encyclopedia points out, his stance hasn't exactly caught on, especially given the historical significance of thought experiments in scientific advancements.
Right, you can't deny their role. Think about Galileo, Einstein. Thought experiments were instrumental in their breakthroughs.
Precisely. It does seem a bit drastic to dismiss them entirely.
But I can also see where the skepticism comes from. Even if we set aside the hardcore empiricists like Duhem, there are still valid concerns about how reliable thought experiments are, particularly within philosophy.
How so?
Well, unlike in science, we can't exactly test our philosophical thought experiments against the physical world, can we?
That's a key difference. A physicist can design experiments to verify their hypotheses, but philosophers often rely on thought experiments to explore concepts and scenarios that are not empirically testable.
Which brings us to another skeptic. The Stanford Encyclopedia mentions philosopher Kathleen Wilkes. She was particularly concerned about thought experiments dealing with personal identity.
Ah, yes, Wilkes. I remember her argument. She wasn't convinced by these thought experiments because they often lack sufficient detail.
Right. Like, take the example of someone splitting like an amoeba. Would we really know how to handle that situation based on these thought experiments? It's all so hypothetical.
Wilkes's concern boils down to the issue of underdetermination. Thought experiments often leave out crucial information, leaving their conclusions open to multiple interpretations.
So it's not that thought experiments are inherently flawed, but that they need to be carefully constructed.
Precisely. Her critique can be seen as a call for more rigorous thought experiments, ones that take into account a wider range of factors.
Okay, so we've heard from the skeptics, but the Stanford Encyclopedia also presents the views of those who believe thought experiments can lead to genuine knowledge. One prominent view is the intuition-based account.
Ah, yes, intuition. This perspective, championed by philosopher James Robert Brown, suggests that thought experiments give us access to a special kind of knowledge, a priori knowledge, knowledge that is independent of experience.
A priori knowledge. So we're talking about truth that we can access through pure thought.
Exactly. Brown argues that through the careful manipulation of concepts and scenarios in our minds, we can arrive at truths about the world. He uses Galileo's falling bodies thought experiment as a key example.
Ah, yes, Galileo. Didn't he challenge Aristotle's view that heavier objects fall faster?
He did. Galileo imagined two objects, one heavy and one light, connected together and dropped from a height. According to Aristotle, the heavier object should fall faster.
Right, that was the prevailing view at the time.
So, if Aristotle was right, the combined object should fall at a speed somewhere between the two individual speeds, right?
Makes sense.
But here's the catch. The combined object could also be considered a single, heavier object, which, according to Aristotle, should fall even faster than a heavier object alone.
Ah, a contradiction.
Precisely. This contradiction, arrived at through pure thought, shows that Aristotle's theory must be flawed. And this, Brown argues, is a case of a priori knowledge. Galileo reached the truth that all objects fall at the same rate through reasoning alone without relying on new empirical data.
So like math, which is also considered a priori knowledge.
Exactly. It's about discovering truths through the power of reason.
That's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it. But how can we be sure these a priori intuitions are reliable?
That's a great question. And of course, not everyone agrees with Brown. Some argue that these intuitions, even if they feel reliable, might just be products of our own biases or cultural assumptions.
So our intuitions could be misleading us.
It's definitely a possibility, but there's also a more naturalistic version of the intuition-based account.
Oh, tell me more about that.
Philosophers like Elk Brendel argue that our intuitions, while fallible, are shaped by our evolutionary history and experiences in the world.
So it's not that we're born with these perfect a priori intuitions, but rather that our intuitions have been honed over millennia to help us navigate the world.
Exactly. They're like mental shortcuts developed through our interactions with reality.
But they're not infallible, but they give us a starting point for understanding.
Precisely. And this naturalistic account, while not requiring a belief in a priori truths, still acknowledges the crucial role of intuition in thought experiments.
So we've gone from skeptics who see thought experiments as mere speculation to those who see them as tapping into a realm of pure thought. It's quite the range.
Indeed, and there are even more perspectives out there, each with its own take on how these mental marvels work.
All right, so we've heard from the skeptics who think thought experiments are just mental games, and from those who see them as windows into a realm of pure thought. Where do we go from here?
Well, the Stanford Encyclopedia points out some other perspectives that try to find a middle ground. One of these is what we might call conceptual constructivism, which is kind of inspired by Thomas Kuhn's work on scientific revolutions.
Oh, Kuhn, his ideas about paradigm shifts and how scientific progress actually happens were revolutionary. How does that connect to thought experiments, though?
This view suggests that thought experiments, instead of revealing some pre-existing truths, actually change how we conceptualize the world. Like, they lead to new knowledge, but through a process of, like, conceptual restructuring.
So instead of uncovering something that's already out there, they help us build new frameworks for understanding.
Exactly. Think of it like taking a puzzle apart and putting it back together, but in a totally new way. The pieces are the same, but the picture you see, totally different. Thought experiments can shake up our existing concepts and force us to create new ones to make sense of things.
It's not about finding some objective truth, but about actively constructing our understanding through these mental exercises.
Right. And this process of conceptual restructuring, it can lead to big shifts in how we see the world, just like the paradigm shifts Kuhn talked about in science.
That's a really cool way to think about it. Okay, so what about experimentalism? That's another perspective the Stanford Encyclopedia brings up. And it seems to tie thought experiments back to, well, actual experiments.
Yeah, this view, championed by Ernst Mach himself, sees thought experiments as a kind of limiting case of real-world experiments.
A limiting case. What does that mean?
Well, Mach argued that we draw on this huge reservoir of what he called instinctive knowledge, stuff we've picked up through our interactions with the physical world.
So it's not that thought experiments are totally disconnected from experience, but that they tap into this deep well of knowledge that's like built into how we understand the world works.
Exactly. It's like all those experiences we have, they inform our intuitions and guide our reasoning, even in purely mental exercises. And just like real-world experiments can lead us to change our beliefs, so too can thought experiments refine our understanding, even without us actually doing anything physical.
So it's about bridging the gap between the abstract world of thought and the concrete world of experience.
Right on. And there's another perspective that tries to ground thought experiments in how our minds actually work, the mental model account.
Oh, I've heard of that. It's about how we build internal representations of the world to make sense of things, right?
Yep. This view basically says that when we do a thought experiment, we're manipulating mental models. These internal representations help us explore different possibilities and even make predictions. It's kind of like building a miniature model of a bridge in your mind to see if it'll stand up before you go and build the real thing.
So it's like we're playing around with these mental models, changing different variables and seeing what happens.
Exactly. And those mental models, they're based on our existing knowledge of the world, how we understand cause and effect, and our ability to picture and play around with complex scenarios.
But this brings us back to the skeptic's challenge, doesn't it? How can messing around with mental models, which are all in our heads, lead to actual knowledge about the real world?
That's the million-dollar question. It's still something philosophers are trying to figure out. How do these non-propositional mental models, images and simulations actually impact our beliefs, which are propositional? It's a tricky problem.
It's like, how can a picture change a sentence?
Huh, Right. There's still a lot to uncover about how those mental gears turn.
Thinking about our listener and knowing they're a philosopher, one thing that strikes me is the importance of narrative in thought experiments.
You're right, that's often overlooked. A lot of thought experiments, they rely on stories to get their point across. Think of Einstein's famous elevator thought experiment. It's not just equations, it's a vivid scene. He puts you inside a sealed elevator so you can practically feel that equivalence between gravity and acceleration.
Right, that's what makes them so engaging. It's that immersive quality, like being transported to another place or time.
And this narrative element, it's super relevant to philosophy. I mean, think about it. Philosophy and storytelling have always been intertwined, from Plato's dialogues to all those thought-provoking works of fiction.
Oh, totally. Like dystopian novels, 1984, Brave New World. Those are like giant thought experiments, exploring what could go wrong with society and making us think about our choices.
They put you right there in that world, experiencing those possibilities, and it makes you reflect on the implications for our own lives.
Which raises the question, can fiction actually be a source of knowledge? Can we learn something real from made-up stories?
It's a great question, and philosopher Catherine Elgin actually argues that yes, it can, through a process she calls exemplification.
Exemplification, fill me in.
It's the idea that fictional scenarios can help us grasp general truths by giving us concrete examples. It's about seeing the universal through the particular, extracting insights from well-crafted narratives.
That connects back to the mental model idea, doesn't it? Both thought experiments and fictional stories, they can help us build and refine those internal models we use to understand the world.
Exactly. They give us a rich playground for exploring possibilities, challenging assumptions, and just expanding how we think.
Well, this deep dive has been a real mind-bender. We've talked about how thought experiments are defined, or maybe more accurately, how they resist being neatly defined and why they're so crucial for philosophy. We've looked at their history, their different types, and all those different views on how they work, from skepticism to intuition, from conceptual restructuring to mental models. Phew.
It's been quite a journey, and throughout it all, we've seen how thought experiments, like well-told story, can really illuminate those complex connections between our minds and the world.
As we wrap things up, what are some things our listeners, especially our fellow philosophers, should be thinking about as they continue their own explorations of thought experiments?
I think the most important takeaway is that thought experiments, while super powerful, aren't perfect. Understanding their different types, their goals, and the various ways people think they work can help us use them more effectively and critically.
It's about being aware of our own biases and assumptions, and really thinking critically about what we can and can't learn from these mental adventures.
Exactly. And as you continue to ponder the world of thought experiments, I encourage you to ask yourself, which view of thought experiments resonates the most with you? Do you see them as glimpses into a world of pure reason, as cleverly disguised arguments, or as tools for shaping our mental models of reality? And maybe most importantly, how can delving into thought experiments make you a sharper philosopher, a more critical thinker?
It's all about embracing that intellectual challenge, that invitation to think deeply and creatively about the world around us and about ourselves.
Couldn't say it better myself.
Well, that's it for this deep dive into thought experiments. Thanks for joining us on this mental adventure. Until next time.